Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online general psychology lecture, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in learning. Now, this is a little misleading. Learning in psychology books typically refers to classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and a few other concepts that we'll talk about in this lecture, obviously. So, with that said, let's jump right into it. Beginning with our operational definition of learning. Learning can be defined as a change in an organism's behavior, knowledge, or thought as a result of experience, responding to stimuli less or more over time. There are many different kinds of learning, but the most basic are first, habituation, which is a process of responding less strongly over time to repeated stimuli, and sensitization, responding more strongly over time. So one example of habituation, kind of the idea again being just exposed to a stimuli over time and then reacting to it less and less over time. So you can imagine a scenario wherein a family member or a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend snores all the time, and at first you're like, oh my god, I cannot deal with this snoring, I'm going to murder this person. But over time, you maybe get used to it and then you respond less strongly to it. Maybe you just want to beat the shit out of that person, or maybe just, kind of a nice little like nudge instead of, wanting to, kill your significant other due to their constant snoring. So the idea here is that over time, after being exposed to that stimuli repeatedly, you react less strongly to it. Versus sensitization, so kind of the exact opposite. So over time, the more you are exposed to a stimulus, the more annoyed you are, the more heightened your response is. You can even go back to the snoring example. So maybe at first you're like, yeah, snoring isn't bad. But then after day after day after day of snoring, you're like, okay, now I am very angry, and the stimuli is making me react more, or just generating a larger reaction from me, the person who's annoyed, over time. And something more serious can, a different example that's more serious can be something like, I don't know, being exposed to something dangerous, knowing that, I don't know, a honking horn or something along those lines means you're about to get run over by a truck. Maybe at first you don't understand why people are honking at you, but over time, if you're walking across the street and you get honked at, maybe, you understand, oh wait, I am in mortal danger, so I'm going to panic. I'm going to have a heightened response, I'm going to run away. So let's walk through the different kinds of conditioning, beginning with classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. This large amounts of learning occur through association, such as a mother's voice to a mother's face. Without association, the world would be nothing but disconnected sensory experiences. The British associationists believed we acquired most knowledge via conditioning. Conditioning can be defined as forming associations among stimuli. Once we form these links, like the connection between our mother's voices with their faces, we need only recall one element of the pair to retrieve the other. So kind of the idea here is that we learn by forming, as stated, kind of associations about the world around us. So in the case of mother's voice to mother's face, maybe, this serves kind of a evolutionary purpose wherein we recognize our toddler can be in another room, hear their mother's voice and recognize that it's their mother calling because they have this association between their mother's voice and like the existence of their mother. And basically the argument is without this constant forming of associations between different stimuli, the world would be meaningless. We would have no kind of way to have certain expectations about how the world operates around us. So for example, if we eat an apple, we have a general idea that it's going to taste like an apple. And if it doesn't taste like an apple, something is wrong. It's kind of one example here of why these kind of associations matter. Moving on to a little more about Pavlov specifically, he was a Russian physiologist and 1904 Nobel Prize winner. His most famous for work on digestion of the dog. This included the first work on classical conditioning, or what believed to be the first work on classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, according to Pavlov, depended on 5 primary components: the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, in the conditioned stimulus, and I should say also the conditioned response. And we'll walk through each of these 5 components in more detail. And we'll walk through them by giving an example of how classical/Pavlovian conditioning would work. So first, what a researcher, anybody would do, was start with a neutral stimulus, an NS, which does not elicit a particular response, such as a metronome/bell. If you randomly ring a bell for a dog, it's not going to do anything. So the idea with neutral stimulus is that when that NS, the neutral stimulus, is used, there's no explicit response by an individual, by an animal, by a dog, by anything. So specifically, you can imagine a newborn puppy, and you walk up to it, or even, whatever, a 2-month-old puppy, and you just start ringing a bell. Well, the dog is going to do nothing. It's just, that it doesn't mean anything. That bell has it's not associated with anything. It's neutral. It's a neutral stimulus. So if you randomly ring a bell for a dog, it's not going to do anything because, again, it's not associated with anything. It's just a bell. It has no idea what a bell is or why it's currently being ringed. So continuing on, you pair what researchers do is pair the neutral stimulus again and again, so repeatedly, with the unconditioned stimulus response, which elicits an unconditioned response. So the idea here is that an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits an automatic reflective response. That is a meat powder. An unconditioned response is the reflective response. It doesn't need to learn how to respond to the unconditioned response, salvation. So kind of the idea here is that researchers don't have to do anything. In the presence of this stimulus, there'll be an automatic reflective reaction. So for example, if you hold up a sausage, a cheeseburger, whatever to a dog, it's going to start drooling. It's going to get very excited. It's going to be an automatic response to that stimuli, in this case, cheeseburger or meat powder. So without the researchers doing anything, the dog is going to be very happy about the presence of a cheeseburger. And that cheeseburger is the stimulus. It's the unconditioned stimulus. So again, nothing needs to be done, so it's unconditioned. And then it's a stimulus, so basically the object that's being used in this kind of experiment or this process. And then we finally have the unconditioned response. Kind of, again, straightforward. It's unconditioned, so it's automatic. It's a reflex. Nothing by the researchers have been done. And then a response. So it's a response to the stimulus. Kind of straightforward here. So it doesn't need to learn how to respond to the unconditioned response, salvation. So kind of the idea here, again, going back to a cheeseburger example, we give a dog a cheeseburger, and the cheeseburger is the unconditional stimuli. In this case, because nothing was done by the experimenters, it's just like, okay, here's a cheeseburger. Cheeseburger exists. And in response to the cheeseburger existing, being in front of the dog starts drooling, it starts running around, it starts doing exciting thing. It's very excited because of the presence of a cheeseburger. So that is unconditioned response. That is, again, the experimenter did not teach the dog to drool in response to the cheeseburger. It didn't teach it to spin around and have the zoomies in response to the cheeseburger. It did not. The experimenter did nothing. The dog is automatically drooling and running around. So thus, it's unconditioned, and it's a response. So a response to the presence of the cheeseburger. So what the researchers will do is they'll take that cheeseburger, that unconditioned stimuli, and then pair it with the neutral stimulus. Again, that bell, the bell that means absolutely nothing. The dog has no idea what the bell means. It's irrelevant. It's not going to drool in the presence of the bell. It does not care about the bell. So what the researchers do is take that bell and take that cheeseburger and pair them together. So every time the experimenter will give the dog a cheeseburger, the experimenter will ring a bell. So here's a cheeseburger, bam, immediately I ring a bell. So just do that repeatedly. And after repeatedly doing that over and over again, introducing the cheeseburger while at the same time ringing the bell, eventually that neutral stimulus, aka the bell, the metronome, becomes a conditioned stimulus, eliciting a conditioned response, salvation. So metronome and salvation, or salvation, I should say. The organism reacts the same way to the conditioned stimulus, the metronome, as it did to the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder. So now what happens is, because the cheeseburger and the bell were presented to the dog at the same time, the dog came to understood that any time the bell rings, a cheeseburger is coming. So now the bell is no longer a neutral, it doesn't mean anything to the dog. Now the dog understands, oh shit, if I hear this bell, that bell means cheeseburger. Thus, now the bell is a conditioned stimuli. It's been associated with the presence of cheeseburger by the experiment. And the bell will, so if a researcher rings the bell, the dog will start salivating because it's anticipating the presence of a cheeseburger. So now the bell is a conditioned stimuli, and the salivation in response to the ringing of the bell is a conditioned response. And that is a Pavlov's experiment and classical conditioning more generally. Now let's talk about some general principles of conditioning, or I should say classical conditioning, beginning with acquisition, defined as learning phase during which a conditioned response is established. It's gradual learning or acquiring of the conditioned response. The closer in time the pairing of the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli, the faster learning occurs. This is believed, well, possibly linked to evolutionary reasons. That is, the stimulus that immediately precedes it is more likely to have caused it than one in the distant future. So kind of putting this back to our cheeseburger example, and our main takeaway here is that the closer in time the conditioned stimuli, that is the bell, and the unconditioned stimuli, the cheeseburger occurred together, the stronger that association becomes. So if every time for example, I present a dog with a cheeseburger, and then say I immediately, within like 1 second, I ring that bell, that makes the learning process, that conditioning process, occur quicker. Versus, imagine a different scenario wherein I present a dog with a cheeseburger, and then 2 hours later I ring a bell. Well, that's going to be very difficult to understand for the dog how that bell is linked to the cheeseburger, because in the last 2 hours, there's been a million sounds. There's been a million stimuli in their environment. All kinds of things have happened. So it's really not a clear association between those two variables. That is, that conditioned stimuli, the bell, and the unconditional stimuli, the cheeseburger. But as stated, the closer that those two things occur together, again, the bell and the cheeseburger, the stronger, the faster that learning process occurs. And again, this is thought to be believed may possibly linked to some evolutionary reasons. So kind of the idea here is that the more quickly that stimulus that immediately precedes it is more likely to have caused it. So kind of the idea here is the closer two things are together, the more likely it is that those two things are related for some reason, is kind of the idea. And you can imagine this, again, kind of in a dangerous situation. You're out in the wild and you hear like a wolf howling, and then like 1 second later the wolves start attacking you. Well, you understand, hey, wolf howling is probably going to mean the wolves are about to attack you. Versus wolf howling and then 5 days later something else attacks you. You're not going to think, okay, well, it's probably because the wolf howled 5 days ago. So kind of it's kind of a survival mechanism as well. So extinction. The reduction and elimination of the conditional response after the conditional stimulus is presented repeatedly without the conditional stimulus. Ring the bell forever and the dog never gets meat powder. So let's walk through this more in English. So the reduction and elimination of the conditional response. So kind of the idea here is what they're trying to do is extinct the conditional response. That is the salvation in response to the bell. Well, how do they do this? Well, what they do is they kind of reverse what they were doing before. So what they do is they'll ring the bell, if a researcher is trying to extinct a conditional response. What they'll do is ring the bell, and instead of immediately giving a cheeseburger, what they'll do is they'll never give the dog a cheeseburger. So they'll ring that bell all the time, like over and over again, and then never give the cheeseburger to the dog. And what the dog learns is that, I guess when this conditioned stimuli, aka the bell, is rang, is presented to me, I'm not going to get a cheeseburger anymore. That unconditioned stimuli that I really want, that cheeseburger, is not ever going to come anymore. So therefore, that association is not strong in my mind anymore. Therefore, that association is no longer meaningless because the cheeseburger is never going to come. Therefore, I'm going to stop drooling when the bell is rang, because now I understand that when the bell rings, nothing happens. There is no cheeseburger, and that's how extinction occurs. All right, moving on to other principles of classical conditioning. Stimulus generalization. The process by which conditioned stimuli is similar but not identical to the original conditioned stimulus elicit a conditioned response. It operates on a generalization gradient. The more similar to the original CS, the metronome, and the new CS, the bell, is the stronger the CR will be, a different bell versus the original bell. So kind of the idea here is, breaking this down here, we have stimulus, generalization. So kind of the idea is that we have that conditioned stimuli, that is the bell. The dog understands that when you ring the bell, a cheeseburger is coming. So kind of the idea here is that you can introduce different bells to the dog that are kind of similar, and the dog will react in similar ways. So imagine that I have, I don't know, a Pikachu or some kind of Pokemon bell or something that makes makes some particular sound. But then say I introduce a new bell to the dog and say it's like, I don't know, SpongeBob bell, and it makes some kind of similar but kind of different sound. Kind of similar, but definitely different. Well, the dog will still drool in the presence of that new bell, and that's what it means by generalization. So that kind of conditioned stimuli of bell representing cheeseburger now has been applied to other bells. However, it's important to keep in mind that the closer the stimuli are together, that is, the closer the bell possibly looks, the new bell looks like the older bell that was conditioned, or sounds, or the closer it sounds like the old bell, the stronger the conditional response will be. So in English, the closer those bells look and sound, the likelihood that the dog will continue to drool at the same levels in the presence of both bells. But if the bell is completely different and is making a completely different sound, then the dog is not going to understand that this stimuli also represents that means that they're also going to get a cheeseburger. It's the stimuli are too different. If it's too different, the dog won't recognize that new bell as representing cheeseburger. It's no longer a conditioned stimuli. It's back to being a neutral stimuli. So it kind of operates on a gradient. So wherein the closer the new bell or the new stimulus is to the original conditioned stimulus, the stronger that conditional response will be. In this case, kind of drooling. Moving on to stimulus discrimination, process by which organisms display a less pronounced conditioned response to conditioned stimuli that differ from the original conditioned stimulus. Occurs when one exhibits a particular CR only to certain stimuli, but not to similar others. So let's put this back in English here. So this time we went from generalization before, now we're going to discrimination. So kind of the idea here is that we are going to respond, have a less pronounced response, have a weaker response to a conditioned stimuli that differ from the original conditioned stimuli. So a specific example would be, say in real life, we're really scared of tornadoes. We hear a tornado warning call, whatever the warning system in the city, and then we're like, oh shit, a tornado's coming, let's run for the hills. Versus, we were watching a movie about a tornado. We're watching Twister, and that same siren goes off, and then people start panicking in the movie. Well, the people who are watching it aren't going to panic because we understand we can discriminate between a fictional TV tornado and the real world tornado. So thus, we're not going to all of a sudden hear the movie sirens go off, and then all of a sudden, okay, I got to get to the basement, I got to get to the bathroom because there's a tornado that's going to blow up my home. So even though those stimulus are very similar, in fact, exactly the same, they're both tornadoes, we're able to discriminate between the TV tornado and a real tornado, and thus modify our response to, those two different types of tornadoes. Next, higher order conditioning. Developing a conditioned response to a conditioned stimuli by virtue of its association with another conditioned stimulus. So let's go through the jargon. Process in which organisms develop classically conditioned responses to conditioned stimuli associated with the original conditioned stimulus. For example, if after conditioning the dog to salivate to the metronome, the original conditioned response, you paired a picture of the bell, a new conditioned response, at the same time you would elicit salivation, a conditioned response. However, it becomes weaker the more distant the association to the original conditioned stimulus. All right, so let's put this in English. So we already have, for example, that the dog already understands that if you ring a bell, a cheeseburger is going to come, right? So what this higher order conditioning does is now what researchers will do, well, they'll introduce another new neutral stimulus to this kind of a classical conditioning learning. So what you can do is every time you ring the bell, you can also present a photograph of the bell and then hand the dog a cheeseburger. So now you have the original conditioned stimuli, that is the bell, and then you have the presence of the cheeseburger. Now you're introducing a new kind of neutral stimuli, but then conditioning it to make it a new conditioned stimuli. So you say, okay, dog, you already understand that bell equals cheeseburger. Now we're introducing this photo, and now photo also means cheeseburger. And the idea is now you don't even need the bell anymore. Now you can just hold up a photo of the bell, and then the dog will understand, oh, I'm about to get a cheeseburger. Now you could do this repeatedly and keep adding new stimuli on it, so on top of it over and over again. But the more stimuli you have, the harder it becomes for a dog to remember that this now second, third, fourth stimuli eventually means that I'm going to get a cheeseburger. So kind of the more things you add to the equation, the harder it is for the dog in this case to understand that this new conditioned stimuli, this multiple new conditioned stimuli equal that initial relationship of bell equals cheeseburger. Some applications for classical conditioning. Advertisers repeatedly pair their products with stimuli that elicit automatic reflective positive emotions, such as sunsets or popular music. Advertisers also make extensive use of higher order conditioning. Condition responds to a conditioned stimulus by virtue of its association with another conditioned stimulus. They pair products with celebrities/attractive individuals. So they attempt to establish classical condition connections between their brands in a positive emotion. So for example, name your favorite hot celebrity, and in your mind, thinking of that hot celebrity means joy. It means that person's hot, I'm happy, whatever. I'm in the presence of this person that I admire. Well, theoretically, Budweiser commercial, Corona, whatever other beers, Heineken, whatever. Pay for that celebrity to drink their beer on a commercial, and then what is trying to happen is, okay, I already have this association between hot celebrity and feeling good, and now I'm adding this beer to kind of that equation. So now I'm introducing a new stimuli to this equation. So now kind of theoretically, every time in the presence of Budweiser, Corona, Heineken, I'm now thinking of that celebrity, that equation that I have in my mind, that celebrity equals hot. So so I'm kind of linking that association of celebrity equals joy to this new stimuli, in this case, a product, beer, and they do so obviously to kind of increase your likelihood of buying beer, because in your mind you're going to be like, oh, Corona means celebrity, which means hot person, which means happy. Therefore, I'm going to unconsciously buy Corona, Budweiser, Heineken, whatever. Now, does that really work? Not really, but I mean, people pump a ton of money into it. Other applications of classical conditioning. Conditioning and stimulus generalization can explain how we acquire phobias. John Watson, a famous psychologist, sought to disprove Freud's theory of phobias, because all these psychologists are constantly beefing. Again, there's all kinds of different theories. There's no like, okay, everybody believes X. These are competing theories that people argue over. So for John Watson to disprove Freud's theory of phobias, which Freud argued phobias stem from deep-seated conflicts buried in the unconscious. He did an experiment called the Little Albert experiment. This is a very classical seminal study. There's questions of the validity of this, but we're not kind of getting into this in this lecture. But kind of the general idea is, the classical tale of Little Albert was that this little kid, I don't know, 4 or 5, whatever he is, years old, Little Albert, he loved rats. He loved white rats. Every time he saw rats, he was like, oh, I'm very happy I see the rat. Well, what John Watson tried to do is kind of prove that, oh, I can teach this kid actually to hate rats. Even though he loves rats on his own, I'm going to teach him and demonstrate that I can teach phobias, and specifically I can make this person hate rats. So what John Watson did was, every time he would hand a lovely, beautiful white rat to Little Albert, at the same time, he would ring a very loud, obnoxious gong, which hurt the kid's ears. So I hand you a rat, then boom, big gong. And each time now, I'm pairing that the presence of that rat with this very unpleasant sound of this gong that's very rattling, disturbing. Now, over time, as John Watson kept doing this, Little Albert developed a new conditioned response to rats. So that is the researcher conditioned how little Albert would react in the presence of rats. So what happened was eventually John Watson would just present the child with a rat, a white rat, and the kid would just start crying, because the kid is now expecting that this gong is going to go off and it's going to upset him. So now that crying is a conditional response, and now the rat is a conditioned stimuli, because the rat now has been conditioned by John Watson to mean that, hey, this gong is about to happen and it's going to blow your ears out. And then next, what John Watson did, he would bring in other little small animals like rabbits or a small dog that was also white. And again, little Albert would start crying because it's close enough to that original rat. That means that gong is about to happen and I'm going to blow my eardrums out. So kind of the idea here is this is how phobia is developed, wherein we develop a negative relationship with something, and then things that are kind of similar to it, in this case, dogs, a rabbit being close to a rat, we're going to kind of apply that relationship to this other stimuli. Again, we're taking little rat equals long, loud gong, loud, just hammering, my eardrums very much hurting. And we're going to take that association and apply it to other things that are like it, such as a rabbit and dogs. So if I presented a white dog or a white rabbit to little Albert, he's going to start crying because he's going to assume that that gong is going to be rang due to the presence of that small white animal. However, interestingly, other small white things did not make little Albert cry. So if John Watson gave little Albert a cotton ball, for example, the child would not cry, which again represents, kind of going back to that gradient point, the stimulus have to be, the more closer those stimulus are in visual appearance and or sound, the higher likelihood of the conditional response being elicited in an individual. And then counter the opposite of that, fear stimuli may be paired with relaxation to treat phobias. So again, kind of this classical example, Little Peter. Again, these are small case studies, historical case studies, which are in general pretty inaccurate, but I'm just going to teach it for the purpose of this class, and we'll kind of tease them apart in future classes, but it's fine for this kind of gen psych class, so you know the general background. Little Peter, who was the opposite, he was scared of rabbits, and what researchers did was that every time a rabbit was in Little Peter's presence, that they would give the child a toy. So now, and then eventually through time, rather being scared of the presence of rabbits, Little Peter was excited, he was happy, because now the presence of rabbits meant the presence of eventually candy or just happiness or joy. Moving on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is defined as learning controlled by the consequences of the organism's behavior. The organism gets something because of its response, also known as instrumental conditioning. Behaviorists refer to behaviors produced by the animal to receive a reward as operants. Animal operates on its environment to get what it wants. And this chart is pretty useful, I've found. A difference between classical and operant conditioning. So in classical conditioning, the target behavior is automatic. It's things that already happen. The drooling, or I should say in response to a cheeseburger. It's happening automatically. Pavlov did not have to teach his dog to love meat. Versus operant conditioning is voluntary behavior. The dog or whatever person, animal has to do a voluntary behavior. It doesn't just occur naturally. It's not occurring automatically. It's not reflective. They have to try and put effort into completing the behavior. In classical conditioning, the reward is provided unconditionally, versus operant conditioning is contingent on behavior. That is, if you do a specific behavior, I will give you the reward, and that behavior is done voluntarily. The law of effect. If a response in the presence of a stimulus is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between stimulus and response will be strengthened. If we're rewarded for a response to a stimulus, we're more likely to repeat that response to the stimulus in the future. So kind of the idea here is that if your voluntary behavior in the presence of a stimulus, whatever stimulus it is, makes you feel good, then the association, that bond, that correlation between stimulus and response will be strengthened. Basically, the straightforward thing is if I feel good about doing that behavior, if I get a treat, candy, whatever, a gift or something along those lines, for responding to the stimulus in a certain way, I'm more likely to repeat that response in the present in the future because I want that good feeling. I want that gift. I want that treat, whatever, along those lines. Stimulus and response theorists argue that our complex behaviors reflect the progressive accumulation of associations between stimulus and responses. Almost everything we do voluntarily results from gradual buildup of SR bonds due to law of effect. So kind of the idea here is that these theorists argue that everything we do, all our behaviors, is a response of thousands, millions of just associations between stimulus and responses. So I kiss someone because it feels good. I'm driving because I can ultimately get to eat pizza at whatever, Cece's. I'm reaching for a plate on the or reaching for food on my plate because I'm going to get rewarded with a pie or something along those lines. But kind of the idea here is kind of, again, two principles here is that if behavior in the presence of a stimuli feels good, it's satisfying, I'm going to repeat that response in the presence of a stimuli. And then these theorists also argue that everything we do is just basically a series of these feel-good associations that have accumulated across time. And again, another classic psychologist here is E.L. Thorndike, in another classic seminal study. Formulated the law of effect after experimenting with cats in puzzle boxes. So what Thorndike did was put cats in a box with a yummy fish outside the box, which the cat would presumably love. And basically what happened was when Thorndike put the cats in the box, the cat was just kind of freaking out, flying around, really not trying to get out of the box, but also trying to get to the fish, but really with no discernible game plan, just kind of freaking out. However, with time, cats eventually got out of the box, but they only did so after kind of accidentally opening the door. They accidentally pulled on the string that opened the door purely by just flailing around so much that eventually they got out. However, what Thorndike did was he would keep putting the cats back into the box. And what Thorndike found was that with each attempt in the box, the cats got a little quicker with escaping from the box. And what Thorndike argued was that this demonstrated that learning was based on trial and error through a steady buildup of SR associations. And that is stimulus response association. So kind of the idea here is that these animals had no insight. They did not understand the underlying nature of the problem, how to escape the box. They weren't doing any complex work, but rather they were just flailing around at everything. And eventually they formed an association between pulling that string and getting fish, and then that is how they learned to escape the box, through that association between again, string and then eating a fish. Building on this, another classic old psychologist was B.F. Skinner. He followed up on Thorndike's work on the law of effect. And Skinner designed the Skinner box, or the operant chamber, to record organisms' activities more effectively. Electronically recorded an animal's responses and prints graphs on animals' activities. So the Skinner box typically contains a bar that delivers food when pressed, a food dispenser, and a light that signals when rewards are coming. They didn't rely on human observation. So the idea here is that you put this rat in this box, there's buttons on the wall, and the rat over time will learn that by pressing this button, I will get food, and then this recorder will basically record how many times, how often, how quickly the rat will press that button to get food. And these are like the classic experiments and people arguing that, hey, if you put a rat in a box and then have cocaine available, the rat will keep pressing cocaine until it kills himself because of that established relationship, that bond between pressing the button and getting cocaine. In this case here, we have pressing the button, getting food. And kind of one benefit of this research design is basically you just put this rat in this box and you can leave for hours, days, or whatever, and your data is still being recorded by this recording device attached to the wiring of that button that releases food for the rat. Reinforcements are outcomes that increase the probability of a response. There are two types of reinforcements. A positive reinforcement, which is a presentation of a stimulus that strengthens the probability of a behavior. Candy if you do something I want. Negative reinforcement, the removal of the stimulus that strengthens the probability of a behavior, ending timeout after a child stops being annoying. So the important takeaway here is that reinforcements increase the probability of a response, a voluntary response. You want a particular response to increase in an organism. So in positive reinforcement, for a child, for example, you can say, okay, if you do your chores, I will give you $1. If you I don't know, go do your homework, I will buy you a piece of candy, something like that. So I'm giving you a stimulus. I'm presenting you a stimulus that strengthens the probability of you doing your chores or doing your homework. So giving you something, and so that's what it means, positive. Providing the stimulus that's positive increases the probability of the behavior. That's what reinforcement is. And negative reinforcement is similar. So we want to increase the probability of a behavior. So let's say we want to increase the probability of a child like calming down, being chill, relaxing. What we'll say is that we will remove this stimulus if in order to strengthen the probability of you calming down. So what we'll say is we will remove you, we will end time out in an effort to increase the probability of you remaining calm. So we have positive reinforcement wherein we present a stimulus to increase the probability. So we can say, I give you a piece of candy to make you shut up and be calm, versus negative reinforcement. So I'm taking away a stimulus to increase the probability of behavior. So I'm taking away timeout to increase the probability of you being chill now. So the child comes to understand that being chill means that that this time then timeout will end. So by me being voluntarily stop being annoying, or voluntarily being chill, relaxing, not being the timeout, the stimulus will go away. The timeout will go away. Is kind of the idea about operant conditioning. Versus punishment. Punishment is defined as outcomes or consequences of behavior that weakens the probability of the behavior. So reinforcement is I'm trying to increase the likelihood of a behavior happening, while punishment is I'm trying to weaken the probability of a behavior happening. So, like reinforcement, it can be positive or negative. Positive involves administering a stimulus that the organism wants to avoid. So, laughing at someone spanking a child. Negative involves the removal of a stimulus the organism wishes to experience. Take away a favorite toy. So in positive punishment, I'm presenting a stimulus, so that's why it's positive. I'm introducing a stimulus to kind of this social circumstance. And it's punishment because I want that organism to stop doing a behavior. So for example, a child is crying at a supermarket. I'm now going to, pull out my wooden spoon, and I'm going to hit this child. So that's the presence, the introduction of this wooden spoon that means it's positive, and I want that child to stop crying at the supermarket. So I'm trying to weaken the probability of that behavior. So I'm going to spank that child. Versus negative, the removal of stimulus that an organism wishes to experience. So again, you can imagine a child like crying in a supermarket, and what you say is, listen, I'm going to take away your favorite toy, your favorite video game, to make you stop crying. So I'm trying to decrease the probability of you crying by taking away a stimulus, by removing a toy, for example. Disciplinary actions are punishments only if they decrease the chance of the behavior happening again. So that's the difference. One is attempting to decrease behavior, one that is punishment, versus reinforcement, which is trying to increase the probability of a voluntary behavior. Behavioralists argue that punishment is much less effective than reinforcement in modifying human behavior. Punishment has several disadvantages, they argue. It only tells individuals what not to do. It can create anxiety and encourages subversive behavior. may provide model for aggressive behavior and cultural effects. So kind of the idea here is that you're not telling the child what to do, you're only telling the child what not to do. You may be creating kind of a model for aggressive behavior to kind of fix your issues. You may contribute to the child developing anxiety because the child fears that eventually they're going to be spanked or something along those lines. So they're constantly on edge, scared of that punishment. And it also may just encourage childs to just be sneaky. Like, I want to avoid, obviously, that punishment. I really don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm anxious. So I'm just going to lie about things. I want to be more sneaky to kind of avoid that punishment, is what behavioralists argue. Some terminology for operant conditioning: discriminative stimulus, a stimulus that signals the presence of reinforcement. So you can snap at a dog, they come to us because they're going to get a pet or treat. So the dog now has kind of like associated that if they voluntarily perform some kind of action, that is in this case, recall, come to you when called, they understand that they are going to get pet or a treat. So in this case, the snap or calling the dog's name is signals that positive reinforcement is about to occur, that is being pet or receiving a treat. So let's talk about different ways of administering reinforcement, or specifically schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement refers to the pattern of delivering reinforcers. The simplest is continuous reinforcement, which means reinforcing every single time. Dog always gets a treat for fetching a toy. Partial reinforcement occurs when we reinforce responses only some of the time. They're more resistant to extinction. If a dog gets a treat for fetching a toy only once in a while, it's more likely to continue trying to catch it in the hopes of getting reinforcement. So continuous reinforcement, kind of straightforward, it's continuous, it's always. So every time the dog does its favorite trick that you taught it, so for example, sitting or something along those lines, every time the dog sits, you give it a treat. That is continuous reinforcement. Versus partial reinforcement, again, straightforward. You only reinforce it sometimes. And kind of the idea here, behavioralists argue, is that because the dog does not know for sure when it's going to get the treat, it's going to be more committed to performing that behavior, more committed to sitting, to fetching, whatever, because it kind of knows it has to stay on its game because it really doesn't know when the next treat is going to come or not come. So it's like, okay, well, I got to really be like attentive to what my owner is telling me because this may be the time I get a treat. Maybe if I do it really perfectly, I'll get a treat. So kind of that's the idea here. And through that constant vigilance, it's thought or argued by behavioralists that this kind of association between treat and sitting would be less likely to extinct, aka like kind of forget that association, because the dog is so vigilant, focused on like sitting to get a treat, because they don't know when the treat's going to come, that association is going to remain stronger over time. And in general, when you're dog training, in the beginning, you reinforce every time the dog does something, but over time, you reinforce less. So you don't always have to carry a big old bag of like dog treats with you. You tell the dog to sit, come, whatever, and the dog will do its or adhere to that command. And that would be an example of partial reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement vary along two dimensions: the consistency of administering reinforcement, that is, it's fixed, regular, or variable, irregular. Variable tend to yield more consistent rates of responding. The dog never knows when the treat is coming. The basis of administering reinforcement varies by ratio, that is, the dog is reinforced on the basis of the number of responses it's emitted, or interval, reinforced on the basis on the number of time elapsed since the last reinforcement. And going back to fixed and variable, that's kind of like what we talked about before. So kind of a regular fixed schedule of reinforcement versus kind of variable, irregular. So not the dog not knowing when or how often I get rewarded. And then you have the second part, which is ratio. So you could say, imagine a dog sitting. So every time the dog sits, they get a reward, or every 5 times a dog sits, they get a reward, versus like every 5 for interval, which is time-based. So something like every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, the dog gets a reward. But let's jump into more specific examples. So as I stated, those 4 dimensions being fixed versus variable and ratio versus interval. So let's walk through some of the specific examples. We have fixed ratio, which is a reinforcement after a set number of responses. So for example, a dog gets a treat after fetching a ball every 10 times. So after so kind of straightforward here, you get a reinforcement after the organism, or in this case the dog, completes that behavior after X amount of attempts. So in this case here, after every 10 fetches, the dog will always receive a treat. So it's fixed, it's set and locked in stone. Every 10 the dog gets a treat, and it's ratio because it's based on the number of attempts. So after every 10 attempts, the dog gets a treat. Variable ratio, reinforcement after a specific number of responses on average. On average, the dog gets a treat after every 10 fetches. So it's ratio because it's based on a number of specific responses. But it's variable because it's not the same number of responses every time. So you can say, again, on average, a dog gets a treat after every 10 fetches. But you can say, well, Monday, I want to reward the dog after every 5 fetches. But on Tuesday, I want to reward the dog after 15 fetches. So you can see how it's variable. But so you have an average of 10 fetches, but on a given day, it can be 5 or 15. Moving on to fixed interval, reinforcement after a specific amount of time. So every 5 minutes of fetch, the dog gets a treat. So it's fixed because it's set in stone, and it's interval because it's time-based. So after every 5 minutes, the dog gets a treat for performing, just say, imagine a dog sitting and doing tricks for, just continuously doing tricks. And you can say, okay, it's been 5 minutes, Fido, now it's time for your one treat. And then obviously at the 10-minute mark, 15 mark, etc. Variable interval, reinforcement after an average time interval. On average, every 5 minutes of fetch, the dog gets a treat. So you can, again, imagine a dog doing all kinds of tricks for an hour straight, and you can say, okay, on Mondays, or you can say, okay, overall, I want to reward the dog every 5 minutes, but only on average. So on Mondays, I'll reward the dog every 5 minutes, but maybe on Tuesday, I'll reward the dog every 15 minutes. On Wednesday, I'll reward a dog every 1 minute, something along those lines. So you have variable, so it's fluctuations by the day, and it's interval because it's time-based. So moving into other examples and continuing on with animal training using shaping, fading, and chaining. Shaping is defined as conditioning a target behavior by progressively reinforcing behaviors that come closer and closer to the target. Fading, gradually decreasing the frequency of reinforcing for the not exactly right behaviors over time. So let's start there. What's shaping? So kind of the idea here, imagine a dog doing a handshake or something along those lines. Or, well, let's just stick with handshake. So say I want to teach a dog how to shake hands. So what I could do is, when I'm first beginning trying to teach this dog, say the dog just picks up their paw for 1 second, I can reward the dog. Because it's kind of close, and you do need to pick up your paw to shake hands, but it's obviously not the correct behavior. But then say, okay, now I want, obviously, to shake their hand. So now say the dog holds his paw for a second. Okay, well, now reward again. So the dog is like, okay, if I pick up my hand, and now if I got a reward. If I hold my hand, I get a reward. And then say the dog is now confused and is pawing at you, and then all of a sudden it touches your hand, and then you reward it again. Now it's closer to shaking hands. As you can see here, as the target behavior that is shaking the hands gets closer and closer, you're rewarding the dog more and more. Now, fading is kind of a similar related concept. So now say the dog, so eventually you got the dog to touch your hand, and you're like, okay, that is what I want you to do. Now, I want you to hold your hand there I want us to shake hands for 5 seconds or something along those lines. But say all of a sudden the dog gets confused and it's frustrated, and now it's just picking up its paw again, or just very little picking up the paw again, and it's like, come on, why am I not getting a treat? Well, what the trainer can do is stop you're providing a treat for the dog when they're doing those initially useful but not really the exact behavior. So as I said before, so the dog picks up their paw, you get a reward. Oh, it lunges towards you a little bit, reward, and then it touches your hand, reward. Well, the idea is we want to get them to shake our hand. So what the trainer will do is stop rewarding a dog when they're doing those other less useful behaviors. So just picking up their hand, kind of holding it. So you're gradually over time decreasing the frequency of the behaviors that are not exactly the right behavior. Because at the end of the day, you want the dog to understand, no, I only want you to shake my hand, not this waving around things or whatever, picking up your paw. So we want them to basically it's a bridge to a reinforcement bridge to get them to the behavior you want, and then you want to cut that bridge off because you only want them to shake your hand, not that extra crap. So chaining, linking a number of interrelated behaviors to form a longer series of A cues B
B, Q, C. Each behavior in the chain becomes a cue for the next behavior in the chain. So, for example, you can reinforce pigeons turning towards the paddles, then approaching the paddles and placing the paddles on their beaks, then picking up the paddles with their beaks. So it's just over time chaining behaviors together. And you can also see this on like a dog obstacle course, for example, those famous dog, whatever they're called. Dog Olympics, that's not the correct name. Just dog competitions where they have to run through a series of do a series of obstacles. So basically each one of those obstacles can be individually trained, and then you basically link them together. So some behavioralists use something called token economies in clinical settings to shape desired behaviors. Token economies reinforces appropriate behavior and extinguishes inappropriate ones. Psychologists identify target behaviors. There are primary and secondary reinforcers. Secondary are neutral objects that become associated with a primary enforcer. Tokens, chips, points. Primary, item or outcome that naturally increases the targeted behavior, such as favorite food or drink. So kind of the idea here is that you can imagine like a kindergarten class, and you can say if you're nice the whole year, you get a pizza party. So that's naturally increasing because kids like pizza. And the idea could be, okay, so each day that you're good, I will hand the class one token. And if you get 50 tokens by the end of the year, you get a pizza party. So that neutral object comes paired with that primary reinforcer, that is pizza. You can also see this in behavioral analysts who work with autistic individuals and trying to teach autistic children to act a certain way through kind of the use of these primary and secondary reinforcers. Again, I should say that there is only one method and one theory of autism, one that's kind of seen as kind of a gold method, like the gold standard of methods, but primarily in the U.S. and in Europe, for example, there's alternative theories. There's also alternative theories in the U.S., but kind of that's just one example. And we'll teach about different alternative theories of autism in future courses. However, just to say about token economies, there are questions about if learned behaviors are generalizable to different settings, because in the real world, there's not just going to be this token and then this reward, but rather all this other stimulus going on. So kind of the applicability of how useful it is using kind of those token economies in the real world is debated. Moving on to cognitive theories of learning, early behaviorists did not believe that thinking played much of a role in learning. They argued that thinking and emotions are just covert behaviors. Skinner believed that human/intelligent animals did think, but didn't believe that thinking is any different in principle from any other behavior. It thought that cognitive psychology was unobservable and meaningless. It was pseudoscience. Today, however, psychologists acknowledge that at least some role for cognitions. So Skinner did not care about anything. All he cared about, listen, I have this box, I have this stimulus, you have this response, and that is all there is in life. The very associations between stimulus and response, and that's it. That's humanity. And frankly, if that's not it, it doesn't matter at all. Anything else that doesn't just partake in that, or anything that goes beyond that, is perfect. It's just pseudoscience. I'm drawing the line. I'm in charge. That's it. Well, today that is a theory that was challenged and kind of defeated decades ago, and now kind of psychologists understand that there is a role for cognition in kind of learning among very other competing theories. But following Skinner, this is kind of like the wave that came after it, this cognitive like wave in psychology. So one way is through this that cognition has played a role is stimulus response psychology has given ways to stimulus organism response psychology. The link between stimulus and response isn't mindless or automatic. The way an organism responds to a stimulus depends on what the stimulus means to the organism. Thought processes contribute to conditioning, cognitive conditioning. Our interpretation of the situation affects our conditioning. The interpretation versus learning histories. Yell at a friend. So kind of the idea here is that there isn't like this universal link between a stimulus and response. It's not mindless. It's not automatic. We are interpreting the stimulus and the response, and depending on our interpretation of the stimulus, for example, we're going to respond in a certain way. So literally us thinking about something will impact how we respond to it. Kind of straightforward, but in the day, you know, whatever. It's debated. So, for example, people yelling at each other. A friend is yelling at you, for example, or I should say just yelling in general, or yelling at in a social relationship. So kind of if you have a learning history, a kind of experience with, oh, I always yell at my friend, that's how we talk, or that's how we talk in my culture, very loud, or whatever along those lines, yelling is not going to be perceived as like this negative thing, versus maybe someone who has a different culture, or a different history with yelling, would perceive yelling as a negative kind of stimulus. So again, kind of the idea here is that our histories, our interpretation, how we evaluate our social circumstances are going to impact our response to a stimulus. Moving on to latent learning. Latent learning refers to learning that is not directly observable. People learn, or organisms learn, many things without showing them. It's important to distinguish between competence versus performance. Competence is defined as what we know. Performance is showing what we know. It implies that reinforcement is not necessary for learning to occur. And Tolman argued this in Honzik. And to prove this, or to find evidence for this theory against that reinforcement is necessary for learning to occur, Tolman did an experiment with 3 groups of rats. The first group of rats always received reinforcement in the form of cheese when it got to the end of a maze. So you can imagine rats in a maze, and at the end of the maze was cheese. And again, the first group always received reinforcement in the form of cheese when it got to the end of the maze. So if the rat gets to the end of the maze, the first group of rats always received a cheese reward. The second group never received reinforcement when it got to the end of the maze. And what Tolman found was the first group of rats made far fewer errors when navigating the maze. And that's no great surprise. That's kind of consistent with previous research. But a third group of rats in the experiment received no reinforcement for the first 10 days and then started receiving reinforcement on the 11th day. And what did the researchers find with that third group of rats? Well, they found that the rats in the third group showed a large and abrupt drop in the number of errors while running the maze after receiving their first reinforcer, that is, a piece of cheese. Within only a few days, their number of errors in the third group didn't differ significantly from the number of errors among the rats who were always reinforced, that is, group 1. This research challenged radical behavioralism and implied that thinking plays a role in some form of learning. Tolman argued that the rats in the third group had been learning all along. However, the rats just did not bother to show that they were capable of running the maze because there was nothing to gain. However, once they recognize that there was a payoff for learning, or I should more specifically say for performing running the maze without any errors, they promptly became maze masters. So kind of the idea here is that the rats knew, I should say the rats in the third group, knew all along how to run the maze, but they didn't care. Why should I run that maze? I'm not going to get anything anyway. But however, once they realize, oh man, I'm going to get some cheese if I actually do this and run this maze in a fast manner with few errors, I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to perform well on that maze. Which suggests that the rats in the third group had high competence all along, however, they were choosing to perform poorly because they had nothing to gain from it. So, which again suggested that some kind of thought process is going on, and thus thinking plays a role in learning. Observational learning means learning by watching others. We often learn by watching models, such as our parents, teachers, and others who are influential to us. We watch someone else being reinforced for doing something and take our cues from them. Don't have to engage in trial and error to learn how to do something new. Don't have to learn everything firsthand. It saves time. Jumping out of a plane, driving. So kind of the idea here is by observing other people doing behaviors, people we care about, they will influence how we act. And kind of the idea of having to do everything by trial and error, by trying to having to learn everything independently through, again, kind of series of trial and error would just be disastrous. For example, learning how to drive, jumping out of a plane. If we didn't know, we had no prior learning to driving, if we weren't learning through observation and were driving and had no prior information and understanding of how to drive at all, the first time everybody got into a car, it would be a very deadly experience. Same thing of jumping out of a plane. Prior to jumping out of a plane, you want to watch a demonstration on how to jump out of a plane. Otherwise, every single new jumper would die, would fall to their death. So you learn through observation, through watching others, parents, community leaders, teachers, friends, etc. Thus, again, kind of challenging the idea that I need to be directly reinforced to learn something. Continuing on with observational learning, Bandura's research on observing aggression. So in this experiment, preschool children would watch an adult, the model, interact with a Bobo doll, so it's basically an inflatable doll. One group of children saw the doll beat up the doll, while another group of children saw the model ignoring the doll. So following the children watching the adult either beat the crap out of the dog or the doll, or just ignoring the doll, the children were placed into a room and started to play, and were asked to just play around. But then the experimenter came in and said, "Oh, listen, we need to stop playing. We have something that came up. You can't play anymore. We got to go." And then they would place the child in a third room. So children moved to that final room with only the Bobo, or I should say, children who were moved to the final room with only the Bobo present. The children who saw the aggression, that is the adult beating the crap out of the Bobo doll, were more likely to display aggressive behavior themselves. So kind of the idea here is that children watching how adults interact with this Bobo doll had an effect on their behavior. So if while frustrated, so again, they got frustrated because they were playing with the toys, and then all of a sudden they're interrupted, so kind of they're irritated. So kind of in the presence of that frustration, how do children interact with the Bobo doll? Well, basically what happened was, as stated, the children who saw the parents or the adult beat the crap out of the Bobo doll were more likely to aggressively also emulate that behavior and beat the crap out of the Bobo doll. While the children who did not see the adult beat the crap out of the Bobo doll, aka ignored the doll, were far less likely to engage in aggressive behavior themselves while frustrated and next to the Bobo doll. And you can watch that video to see kind of some footage from that experiment. Media violence in the real-world aggression. Many types of research examine the impact of violent media on behavior. The results suggest that media violence impacts real-world aggression in some cases, but media violence is only one small contributor to a real-world aggression. So kind of the idea here is that the idea of a one-to-one correspondence between media and Y result, like everything in psychology, there is no like one thing that causes a particular behavior, and in the case here of media violence is causing violence, mass violence, is not supported by research. Insight learning, Kohler's chimpanzee in aha moments. So in this experiment, Kohler put chimpanzees in a cage with bananas outside. Two short sticks were inside the cage with the chimp. However, neither could independently reach the bananas alone. Thus, the chimp had to figure out how to use those sticks to reach their favorite bananas. And what happened was the chimps kind of combined those sticks together in order to reach the bananas. And what Kohler argued was that the chimps didn't learn by trial and error. You didn't need this reinforcement and this kind of just blind flowing around and accidentally landing on a stimulus and a response. And that's how learning occurs, if you remember with the cats, that was argued. And here, Kohler's arguing, no, there's this cognitive process going on, this insight, this sudden understanding of a solution to a problem. So by looking at the problem, looking at what you want to get, in this case, the bananas, looking at the tools around you, thinking about what you have in front of you, and then coming to a kind of understanding kind of the limitations of the tools, and then working through a creative solution to figure it out without doing trial and error. And basically what Kohler argued is that, again, learning does not necessarily need trial and error, and does not need that stimulus response of accidentally hitting the open door button and then have that being associated with fish or bananas, but rather, again, this cognitive insight, this thinking through. Kohler argued that this suggests that humans and some other animals may learn through sudden understanding, aka that aha moment, I figured it out. However, one limitation may be to this experiment was that the chimps were housed together, so may have learned by observational learning. But again, even if it was observational learning and maybe not insight learning, this still represents cognitive learning. The chimps themselves did not have to be reinforced each one individually through trial and error to figure this out, but rather either observed other chimps figuring it out or independently came to that aha insight moment by cognitively thinking things through to figure out how to reach those bananas. Preparedness and phobias. Preparedness for certain phobias also contradicts equal potentiality. So kind of equal potentiality is kind of the idea is that you can be conditioned to learn anything. Doesn't matter. Like if you have that stimulus response, I don't care what's going on in your brain, your history, your whatever, your background biology does not matter. Stimulus response is all that matters, according to kind of classical Skinner behavioralist. Everything again is these forms of associations outside of cognitive thought. None of that matters. However, preparedness kind of contradicts this equal potentiality. Again, that all things are equal. Any stimulus is equal and can produce any response that an experimenter wants. Evolutionary predisposition to learn some pairings of feared stimulus over others owing to their survival value is the definition of preparedness. For example, monkeys showed other monkeys react scared to snakes, but do not learn to be scared of reactions to flowers. So kind of the idea here is you can put a monkey who is not otherwise scared of snakes in front of a video wherein they see a monkey freaking out about a snake in their presence. Well, the monkeys who watch that video now can in fact develop a reaction to being scared of snakes. However, if a monkey, for example, is watching a video of another monkey being scared of flowers, that the monkey who's watching that video is very unlikely and does not learn to be scared of reactions to flowers. So kind of the idea here is that all stimulus are not equal potential to be conditioned. You cannot just blindly create a stimulus and response for any set of variables, but rather the monkey's genetic predisposition to being scared of predators, aka snakes, makes them more likely to be able to learn to be scared of snakes. So, as stated, we may be evolutionarily predisposed to be more afraid of certain things than of others. So, for example, I'm more likely to be scared of snakes versus being scared of a car. I'm more likely to be scared of mountains because maybe I'm scared of heights versus being scared of the presence of a dishwasher. I'm more scared possibly of being, it's more likely among humans to be scared of tight spaces, claustrophobia, versus just the presence of a bookcase. Again, all those snakes, mountains, tight spaces may reflect some evolutionary benefit to being scared of, versus it's highly unlikely that I could teach you to be scared of a dishwasher or a bookcase, wherein you see a bookcase and then you start crying. Instinctual drift. The tendency for animals to return to innate behaviors following repeated reinforcement is called instinctive drift. So, for example, researchers conditioned raccoons to drop tokens into a piggy bank for rewards. However, despite being conditioned to drop tokens into the piggy bank for rewards, the raccoons would take the tokens and would simply just rub them together. And in fact, the raccoons treated the tokens like food. That is, the small hard shells they extract from the beds of ponds and streams. So raccoons, and instinctively, kind of in their species, make this kind of rubbing with their hands, because that's how they, or I should say, they make that hand motion to extract food from basically these hard shells. So kind of the idea here is this biological, species-wise understanding of I need to make this hand motion to get food is one, possibly not taught, or definitely not taught through kind of trial and error, but also interferes with being taught new behaviors. So the raccoons, despite being conditioned to take those tokens and put it into a piggy bank, automatically get that token and they start making that instinctual, species-specific motion that is rubbing their hands together, due to theoretically kind of an evolutionary benefit of that's how literally they eat food. So just that you cannot trump, there's a biological limitation on what you can condition that species. You can also see this with some breeds of dogs. So for example, greyhounds are sight hounds. That is, if they see something running or a small animal running, they're going to chase it. So even if you train your greyhound to walk off leash, it still can be very dangerous and typically recommended not to do so, because even though they're trained to be off leash, that species or that variant of dog of being taught for hundreds of years to chase as small animals and being selectively bred to do so is going to interfere with any training that you may have had. or I should say, have a higher likelihood of interfering with any training you've done. Thus, there are biological influences may place limits on what kinds of behaviors we can train through reinforcement. And finally, wrapping up with sleep-assisted learning, many techniques are purported to make you learn better, faster, or more. Research on sleep-assisted learning shows that benefits actually reflect participants waking up. So, for example, you always see these constant or some advertisements of you're going to learn this while sleeping. Well, and the research has found that it's not going to happen. And the research and what researchers have found is that when actually people are demonstrating any learning, it's they're learning when they aren't actually fully asleep. And one way you can test this, as we've talked about in previous chapters, is hooking up people to EEG machines, making sure that they're actually sleeping, and then seeing if they learn whatever more quickly. And research supports that they do not, in fact, learn more quickly. So do not waste your money on sleep-assisted learning. All right, so with that said, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.